Welcome to Small Talk with the Lees. My name is Brandon, and I'm joined with co-host Justin and guests Alejandro and Andre, and we're discussing the CES Letter, which examines the truth claims of the LDS Church. This is part 4. We're going to dive into some lengthy discussion about the Book of Abraham and its translation process. And, when I was creating this podcast outline, I was kind of trying to figure out how to not go too deep in the weeds and get lost, but at the same time not glance over all the issues. So I think you'll find that in the next couple of episodes, I was kind of having trouble trying to balance those two sides. In the first episode, we're going to talk about the textual problems of the Book of Abraham and kind of give an introduction into the issues. It's really a whole can of worms gets opened when I mention biblical criticism and biblical studies, which isn't it's not criticizing the Bible, you might think. It's actually kind of a scholarly study of the text as well as the sources of the Bible. After that, the next episode, we're going to dive really deep into the weeds. So if you're interested in the translation problems of the Book of Abraham, that's going to be the episode after this one. And finally, we're going to conclude the section on the Book of Abraham with kind of a roundtable discussion on how we're to make of Joseph Smith's translation ability and whether or not we should classify Joseph Smith as a fraud based off that. So there's a lot of emotion and there's going to be a lot of discussion going around here. But please tune in and let us know what you think in the comments.
And arrows and the fortune's lost. And there's a voice that's buried deep inside my head. As it stumbled out, it said, hey, I got another chance. I was living like a zombie, head in a trance. Hey, and we're slow, and life is all you know. And when it flashed before my eyes, I realized.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Small Talk with the Lees. We're discussing the CES Letter, and I think we're just going to start with the next biggest issue, really the most problematic issue that the CES Letter talks about for the LDS foundations, and that's going to be the Book of Abraham and the translation. So I think we're going to divide up this segment into about 50% of it. We're going to try to spend on talking about the issues, and I'm going to try not to get too bogged down on the specific issues, but I do want to cover them as much as I can. And I realized, going into this, we actually recorded this last couple weeks ago, and I think all four of us decided that we really don't know too much about this issue. And the more and more I explored it, I realized that there's just so much. There's thousands of pages of scholarship written on this subject. So we're going to cover that. We're going to get to the bulk of the argument. But I want to spend about also half of this segment talking about kind of our reactions, our perspectives, how that shifted maybe because of how we've read about the translation process of the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham. Mm-hmm. So I actually just want to start without diving into any of the issues specifically, maybe just 30 seconds for each of you. How did you kind of react when you first heard about that there were issues or problems with the Book of Abraham? So let's start with who wants to start? Justin?
Sure. I think I first heard about this on my mission. There were people discussing how there was translation issues, how it doesn't match up with what Egyptologists say. And I think my initial reaction was, oh, that's interesting, but I don't really care. And I think that was mainly just because at that point, I was also thinking there's definitely been a lot of people that have gone through these arguments and they justify it somehow. So there's, and I don't come from it from the perspective of wanting to know every single minutia and detail of how they went and translated what is wrong. So I think that was kind of my initial gut reaction. And then now that we've recently started doing the CES letter, looking into, I can see how it could be problematic for a lot of those that take how they take the idea that Joseph Smith literally thought he was translating a document of Abraham and how there could be problems. So I think reading this has just given me a deeper understanding of where it could be problematic, and it has initiated that process of me trying to grapple with these different types of issues. But I don't see it for myself personally as faith shattering.
Okay, great. Let's go, Andre.
Yeah, I probably first heard about I read the Book of Abraham when I was in junior high, and then I didn't really understand a lot of it. It kind of went over my head. And then I heard some arguments about it when I was in high school, I think around my junior year. When one of my family members started to look into a lot of like anti-doctrine, like things that are some things that are relevant, some parts of the CES letter that are questions that, are good questions, and then other things that, are just flat out lies and things like that. And so it was kind of a lot to take in at a time. And so I think I agree with Justin. Like I wanted to hold, and I still want to hold on to my faith first. And I want to take that approach to reading any scholarship or any questions with a grain of salt, analyzing first, is this something to break my faith over, or is it something to just take a look at, understand, and take it from a faithful perspective? And so I think that's what I've done. I think I've taken it faith first, and I've tried to understand it from that perspective.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Andre. And Alejandro.
I can't remember when I started to hear about the problems with the Book of Abraham, probably in high school. But I didn't hear any specific arguments other than like it was very dubious that Joseph Smith had translated it, and of course the facsimiles were like the case example. In fact, the CES letter, the majority of the argument that it makes is something like, if you were to summarize the chapter, generally it's because there are problems with the translation of the facsimiles that puts into doubt the entire text. And then some of the arguments that I've learned, about the Book of Abraham actually aren't included in the CES letter. And actually, as you start digging into it more, you actually discover the more specific arguments as to why it's problematic, and then you can hear the apologists' rebuttal of those arguments.
Okay, perfect. Thank you guys for sharing. I totally agree with you. Like reading the CES letter was actually like the first time I actually started diving into the deep issues, and I realized the CES letter just barely scratches the surface on this. Like you
Right.
start watching YouTube videos of Dan Vogel, and there's so much stuff to cover that there's no way we can cover it in this episode, and I don't plan on doing that either in the future. It's just too much. But so a little background on me. I would say the first time I kind of became aware of this Book of Abraham was at BYU, my freshman year, and they point us to the Gospel Topics essays, and that's kind of like this. It's on the LDS.org website. They have a bunch of scholarly kind of, the church officially addresses scholarly issues under that web page, and they told us to go home and read a bunch of those on our own. So I read the Book of Abraham, and going back and reading that now, like 3 years later, I realized when I first read it, I guess my initial reaction was just like, okay, there's a lot of problems with the Book of Abraham, and maybe I shouldn't treat it. I don't think I would have described it this way 3 years ago, but it was basically, I don't think I should treat everything in it so literally, as compared to the Book of Mormon, where maybe I'm going to treat that with more solidity. And so like basically in Sunday school, if I hear someone open up and try to argue that, like we know this is what happened in the creation story because it says this in the Book of Abraham, I've always kind of had this idea in the back of my head, like, I don't know how much weight you want to put on that opinion, just because I know there's some problems out there. I don't really know what the problems are, but that was kind of my general opinion. Now going back and reading the Gospel Topics essays, I realized that it really kind of talks about a lot of stuff, from the textual arguments as well as the translation arguments as well as the textual value, and I didn't understand really anything when I read that article. So I hope today, like, I'm going to go through in this next section, I'm going to talk about the basically, I'm going to summarize all of the problems and maybe how apologists have responded to that. And I'm going to try to hit on why any of this even matters in the first place, because we're really not going to be talking about the Book of Abraham if we're not talking about the Book of Mormon. Um, if the Book of Mormon didn't exist, there would be no reason to discuss the Book of Abraham, because it really is not super important out of context. So as I kind of described, so I've sent you guys a link with the web document that I created, a Word document with kind of the general summary of issues and the problem with the responses. And so feel free to stop me at any time. I want you guys to listen to this in the perspective of the audience, maybe even, and someone who maybe has very little or to no context. If something I say doesn't make sense, just stop me and I can try to explain again until it makes sense. Or if you want to push back on anything that I present, feel free to jump in. So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with the history. So this is probably going to take the next couple of minutes, but just hold with me. So the whole reason why we're talking about the Book of Abraham today is because we thought, so the Book of Abraham is basically, if you flip open your quad, your scriptures, and you go to the back in the appropriate price, there's a book called the Book of Abraham, and it has a bunch of funky little pictures in it, and like these Egyptian hieroglyphs is what it calls them, and these translations. And then there's a book, it's like 5 chapters long, and it's a story about how Abraham was his dad attempted to sacrifice him, and an angel saved him from that. And then it tells the whole story of Abraham and the worlds without numbers and his journey out of Ur of Chaldees. So that being said, the Book of Abraham has always been in our quad since 1880, and we kind of always just take it as given when we see it there. Now, the whole world of Mormons are going to be thinking, if we can just prove that the Book of Mormon was translated from gold plates, then like everyone, you would have to become a Mormon, basically. And this kind of issue, when the Book of Abraham's papyri, because Joseph Smith said that he translated the Book of Abraham from some Egyptian scrolls that he received. When it became known that these papyri were still in existence in 1967, then the whole world suddenly became very interested, because either we could see that Joseph Smith actually knew how to translate Egyptian, or that he didn't. Okay, so people were really genuinely excited to see what the results were. Unfortunately, if you go to the Gospel Topics essays today and you read the church position on this, after many years of scholarship, they found that what is on the papyri, it is Egyptian, but that does not match what we have in the Book of Abraham, and it does not match what we have in Joseph Smith's translations of it. Okay, so basically, so you have to think about it from Joseph Smith's point of view. Like in 1835, when he purchased the scrolls with the mummies, the Rosetta Stone was already in possession of people at this time. It was in possession back about 30 years before. The only problem, or at least 30 years before, the only problem is that it was cracked before 1835, but it never got cracked into English. And so people living in America, where Joseph Smith lived at the time, would not have known that the Egyptian language code had been indeed cracked by the Rosetta Stone. So, and you kind of see these things where in the translation that Joseph Smith does, he puts like a Egyptian character, and then he puts a whole paragraph explaining what that character means. This is called the GAEL, or the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language. And he does this, and and it's more like a dictionary, because, it's weird to think, okay, Chinese, right? So you got a character, and then you got a word translation, right? So it's a one character, one word translation. But Joseph Smith was putting one character, and he was putting one paragraph of words. And so there's this idea, the reason for this is there's this idea back in the 1800s, before the Rosetta Stone was cracked, that that Egyptian was kind of like this code language, and you could fit an entire paragraph into one character. So we kind of see this as we examine the documents. It's going to be confusing. Why in the world like this would happen or that would happen? And a lot of it turns out to have an explanation, like a reasonable explanation in my opinion. So okay, summary background. Basically, the Book of Abraham is purchased in 1835. The papyrus scroll are purchased by Joseph Smith. He claims that there's two books on these papyri, the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph. Abraham and Joseph, the patriarchs, right? And he begins translating in 1835. And then he finishes translating, I think, 1842. And he publishes what we have as the Book of Abraham. We don't have the Book of Joseph. And then it was believed that these papyrus scrolls were lost in a fire later on, in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And then it was only till 1967, so like almost 100 years later, that we rediscovered that there were portions of the papyri still extant. And that's when all the scholars got excited, because it's either we could prove to the world that Joseph Smith knew how to translate Egyptian, or he didn't, right? And so, okay, so up to this point, I've kind of developed the context for those who know nothing about this issue. I'm hoping that people listening, though, have at least read the Gospel Topics essay, and you kind of get a feel of where this is coming from, and kind of that there are problems with it. So I'm just going to jump into the problems now, and I'm going to start from the biggest problems and go to the least important problems. Okay. So to me, I think we have to have this question in our minds, because really navigating this whole field of debate is really overwhelming. To be honest, I was listening to these videos and I got extremely bored by everything I was listening to, because there's just so much information. They're talking about like pen scribbles and ink, red ink, black ink. The weeds that you get into when you study this really it's just so easy to get lost. And so I think the question that we have to have in our mind when we look through these issues is the Book of Abraham a historical translation or not? Okay, so in other words, did Joseph Smith write it himself, or was he actually translating? Okay, so that's, and I don't think that's the only question to ask, right? Because to me, that's not actually an important question to my faith, but it's extremely important when dealing with these issues. So,
Hey, Brandon, in 1967, do you know if the majority of the historians and the scholars of the church, did they have the perspective also that Joseph Smith didn't translate out of the hat? Was he like looking at the gold plates and also translating from it that way as well?
ooh. So that is a really good question about the hat in the rock. First of all, we actually don't know if Joseph Smith used the hat in the rock for his translation of the Book of Abraham. Dan Vogel talks about that in his Gospel Tangents interview. Now we do know that there was a lot
would they have thought that in 67? Would those
I
scholars?
can tell you, I think it was Joseph Fielding Smith, the prophet. He denied that Joseph ever used a hat in the rock. And I think he was before the 60s. Well, no, actually, he was around that time period. He was around the 60s. So I think it would be a general consensus that most scholars wouldn't have known about the hat in the rock necessarily, but there would be some, and they, and those art scholars would have been familiar with the hat in the rock.
Okay, I'm just curious. All right.
Yeah, so that's a good question. It was believed, though, by practically all the scholars that Joseph Smith actually did translate Egyptian papyri at that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on.
Yeah. So we're going to start. I think the biggest problems to the argument for Book of Abraham being translated from papyri is that actually we don't have to look at the translation process. We can do something called historical criticism or textual criticism. And this is something you learn when you go into biblical studies. And so I'm not an expert at any of this, including biblical studies. I've only dived into it a little bit. But it's not criticizing the Bible. It's not criticizing history. What it is thinking about the text, think about the history in a very scholarly manner, okay, in the most scientific manner possible, okay, to the extent that you can. And so the first thing that you encounter, and David Bokovoy talks about this in his interview on Higher Criticism on Mormon Stories, he talks about the first thing that we have to do is flip to Abraham chapter 1. And if we look at verse 20, okay, it talks about Potter's hill was in the land of Ur of Chaldea. And the Lord broke down the altar of Elkanah. And also, blah, 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 there's a great mourning in Chaldea and also in the court of Pharaoh. Okay, so the problem with this verse that David Bokovoy presents is that this is the only kind of source that we have in the Christian world that links Abraham to Egyptian influence, as far as I'm aware of. Okay, so the problem with that is that basically the book of Abraham states that Ur is where Abraham grew up. Now, Ur of Chaldees, the Chaldeans are linked to the Babylonians, and Babylon is located in southern Mesopotamia, which is far, far away from Egypt. Okay, so there's already a what could be perceived as an anachronism in this text, which is that Joseph Smith is placing Abraham in southern, in what seems would have to be southern Mesopotamia. Okay, now the apologists will try to argue that perhaps Babylon is not actually in southern Mesopotamia. Now, the only problem with that is 99.9% of biblical scholars would not take that idea seriously. And the main reason is because essentially our first five books of the Old Testament rely on the fact that Babylon is a huge influence on the Jewish tradition. So to sum this up, it's basically there would be no Bible without Babel.
Without Babel, there would be no Bible. So if we think about it, going back what we discussed in the previous podcast, Genesis 1 is influenced by the Babylonian story of Enuma Elish. Genesis 2 through 3 influenced by traditions from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here, the flood story comes from Mesopotamia. The Tower of Babel, Babylonian polemic. The laws, the legal collection, from the connection between the covenant collection in Exodus 21 and the Code of Hammurabi, the oldest complete law collection from ancient Babylon. The Assyrian vassal treaties of Esarhaddon, those connect with Deuteronomy. All of this connection, so it's very important from a biblical perspective to show Abram, the father of the Israelite nation, leaving Mesopotamia and coming to the land of Canaan, the promised land.
So I know I'm not going to get into the weeds with there, but we could talk about that more if anybody wants to. The next problem that we're going to go into, the next textual problem, is if we flip open Abraham chapter 2, and we're going to go to verses 1 through 3. So over here is really interesting textual criticism. Not only do you look at Abraham, you have to look at Genesis, okay? So this is the part, it's one of my favorite parts, to be honest, because Jordan Peterson talks about the exploration of the unknown, let's say. And this is kind of where Abraham gets kicked out of his house, and he has to move out of his house, and he's like 62 or 75 or however old you want to put him, but he's old, right? And he has to get out of his dad's basement, basically, and go explore the world so he can find the promised land. The only problem in the Bible is that we have Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, and I'll read it, and it says, "And Terah took Abram his son, blah, 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 and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan." Okay, so in Genesis 11, it says that Terah, Abram's dad, took Abram with him to go into the land of Canaan. Now, if we look to Genesis chapter 12, it's slightly different. It says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will shew thee." So it would seem that there's a seeming contradiction between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12, which is that one said that Abram's dad went with him, and the other seems to imply that Abraham left his father. Okay, and the reason why we have these two discrepancies is because Genesis 11 comes from something called the priestly source, while Genesis 12 comes from the J source. So for those not familiar with biblical criticism, there's basically like four main sources or something like that, where different parts of Genesis and Deuteronomy and the law, they come from different documents, and they're kind of pieced together and compiled over time. So here we have two different sources explaining two different discrepancies. And it's really interesting if you read Abraham chapter 2. Joseph Smith is what I believe is trying to attempt to reconcile the difference in these two accounts. And he just kind of combines them. So if you read verse 1, it talks about how Terah, my father, yet lived in the land of Ur of the Chaldees. And it came to pass that I, Abraham, took Sarai to wife, and Nahor, my brother, took Milcah to wife, who is the daughter of Haran. Now the Lord had said unto me, Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will shew thee. So it seems like if you're coming from this from a biblical studies perspective, it immediately becomes obvious that this is not a direct translation per se, but it is what we're trying to do is deal with the problems during Joseph Smith's time, which is he's reading the Old Testament, he's studying it, and he's trying to piece things together. And then he procures a new source, and I like to describe this as midrash. He's using the Old Testament, and he procures a new source that reconciles the problems of the Old Testament. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people disagreeing with me here, so that's fine if you want to push back. But that is what I'm going to present here on the textual problems of the Book of Abraham. Okay, so the next thing that is a problem with the Book of Abraham is so I guess real quick on that pushback. Basically, you could say that, well, technically Joseph Smith was getting the original source of not only the priestly source and the J source, he was getting direct channel from God to the original source. And so I guess you could make that argument. So I'll just throw that out there if you want to go that route. Let's go to the next textual argument, though. This is going to be the last one. It's basically what the LDS Gospel Topics essay describes. Because the Gospel Topics essay admits that there's a lot of problems with the translations, but let's just focus on the text. Like, what does it actually say when you open up your Pearl of Great Price? Like, where do we get the idea that Abraham was involved in idolatry with his father, that there was human sacrifice, that Abraham was an astrologer? Okay, because these are all ideas floating around in other ancient traditions of the Jewish tradition. So these are not like completely foreign ideas. These are actual ideas that are present today. So it's kind of cool, right? It's like, how did Joseph Smith know about these things if he was just making it up? Okay, let's say. So I think that is a great question. Actually, last time we were recording this, I knew nothing about that, so I just left it kind of open, like, there's some mystery there, right? But so I was listening to some podcasts, though, and I find this extremely interesting. So go to the Gospel Topics essay footnote 46, and you'll see that at the footnote, if you click on it, right at the bottom of it, it says, quote, some of these extra biblical elements were available to Joseph Smith through the books of Jasher and Josephus. Joseph Smith was aware of these books, but it is unknown whether he utilized them. Once we start talking about the books of Jasher and Josephus, which are not in our Bible today, by the way, but they are books you can read online, there's a whole debate on that already. Like, you can listen to Kwaku on YouTube, and he'll debate back and forth with Radio Free Mormon. So I don't even want to jump into Jasher and Josephus. I just want to put it out there. It's definitely possible that Joseph Smith had the knowledge of these traditions. And I think the strongest point on this is actually the study done by the BYU undergrad, or maybe it was the graduate student. I think it was she was doing research with the BYU professor, and she came out with a study that talked about how closely correlated the Adam Clarke Bible commentary was with Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Old and New Testament. And if you go to Adam Clarke Bible commentary, which definitely not only was available to Joseph Smith, but we know that he used it. If you go to Daniel chapter 3, verse 6 of the Adam Clarke Bible commentary, you'll read this. It says, "Be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace," and then it explains this. It says, "This was an ancient mode of punishment among the Chaldeans, if we may credit the tradition that Abram was cast into such a fire by this idolatrous people because he would not worship their idols." So right there in a text that we know was available and used by Joseph Smith, there is a huge tradition that explains how Joseph Smith could have possibly known about that. So I don't know of any argument against that, but that is kind of, so to leave that out there, I think that's the strongest argument against the claim that Joseph Smith did not have access to such knowledge. Okay, if we don't have any questions on, so is any of this making sense? Like, I don't want to be too confusing here. Is there anything that didn't maybe sound completely clear?
I want to hear more about the book of Jasher and of Josephus.
So all I can say about the book of Jasher and Josephus is there's debate whether or not it was available in America before 1835. Okay, and I think they show that one of the books, I think it was Jasher, was indeed available to Joseph Smith in an English translation before 1835, which is when he started translating the book of Abraham. Now, the book of Josephus was not. And the problem with that is there's actually multiple books named the book of Josephus, and they all go under the same name as the book of Josephus. So there were other books of Josephus that had other traditions that mentioned some, maybe, I can't remember specifically, but about the idol sacrifice or him being thrown into a furnace type stuff. Or I think it's the astrology one, actually, that was mentioned in the Josephus that was probably available to Joseph Smith at the time. But if you want to learn more about that, you can watch Kwaku and Radio Free Mormon kind of argue that back and forth.
Mm-hmm. I also want to point out these arguments that we're discussing are not mentioned in the CES letter. And so anyone reading this letter, they're not going to find out about this until they start digging. So, so as far as the CES letter goes, kind of like you said earlier, it sort of just scratches the surface on this kind of stuff. For several years now, there's been a debate in Mormon circles about, because these aren't the only problems that are wrong with the text. There's studies, there are studies done, and this is one argument that is pointed out in the CES letter, where people who analyze the text are seeing that not only did Joseph Smith perhaps borrow from those sources, he also borrowed prose and phrases from New Testament sources as well. And so the Book of Abraham is sort of like this amalgam, sort of like this collage of different ideas and different texts, and it all comes together in this one unified narrative. And so the argument there is, well, is Joseph Smith, or the argument is, this, sheds doubt on the idea that Joseph Smith literally translated this document. This sounds more like an unconscious
plagiarism, but not as strong as plagiarism.
Yeah, like pseudographia.
Kind of,
I don't like the word plagiarism because it has so much negative connotation. Kind of just automatically linked to it. I think I like the word pseudepigrapha.
Pseudepigrapha.
What it does remind.
We don't have to jump into that right away, but
yeah, I'm just saying what it does remind me of. Similar, like you'll hear a lot about every society, ancient society has the ancient flood story, right? Mm-hmm. And because of that, that seems that the Bible has mimicked that, and then it seems that the natural conclusion that they want you to draw from that is that the Bible just ripped that off from other societies because it's not as old as those other ancient stories. So I agree. It does seem to be more problematic for those that hold a very literal translation view, and it was very original things that were coming through for Joseph Smith. And in my mind, it's not as problematic because I I don't think that Joseph Smith had to have this all originally just spring into his mind as new revelation. But yeah, I could see it as being more problematic for taking a very literal, like word by word translation. But I don't see it as that way, just because I think that taking from these general patterns and stories that seem to spring up all over, it kind of reinforces the idea that it is an important story. So, but anyways.
Yeah, so it's a really good point you bring up. One of the things that I learned on my own is Harold Bloom, the famous literary critic, he said about Mormonism that Mormonism was purely American gnosis, and what he meant by that was that Joseph Smith and the Mormons, their behavior sort of parallels the behavior that the early Gnostics had, like the early Christian Gnostics, and not only that, but the early Jewish Gnostics. And one of the things that they would do is they would seek spiritual experiences like visions, and they would also produce um, like prophetic texts using
Mhm.
other people's names, kind of like what Joseph Smith was doing. And when in the previous podcast that we had, I was making the argument that um, the Gnostics were doing this in order to gain an insight or to sort of like break frame on what people sort of assumed about the stories. And I see something sort of similar happening here with the Book of Abraham. Now, to sympathize with the audience, right? Members who are faithful members might say, like, no, that you're getting into like heretical stuff. You're basically saying Joseph Smith is making it up. And for those people who have left the church, let's say, they might say, well, doesn't that concede that Joseph Smith did not literally translate the book? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. That's sort of what we're saying, but it's also pointing out that there's value in doing that. And what Joseph Smith was trying to do, I think, he was trying to help people gain an insight into like a type of theology or certain like progressive ideas that are present in the Book of Abraham. And so, um, again, if you're here's the thing. Here's the thing though. Let's say, for example, your testimony is really connected to the historicity of the Book of Abraham, and let's say you were able to prove that the papyri were, or the translation of the papyri were legitimate and authentic. That still brings into question whether the Abrahamic story presented in the papyri are even true at all. And then and that's a whole other can of worms. And then from there,
yeah, let me just kind of explain that, because I don't think
sure.
people understand that. What I just barely kind of presented here with the issues of the textual problems of the Book of Abraham are, first of all, generally it's not covered in the CES letter.
Right.
It's barely addressed in the Gospel Topics essay, and it's almost wholly avoided by most apologists, because no one does biblical studies in Mormonism except David Bokovoy and like Tony, I think it was Tony Hutchinson. So the problem here is that this isn't just like a faith-shattering view, maybe. Like you could take it as a faith-shattering view, not just for Mormonism. This is kind of hitting at all three major religions: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which all rely on the story of Abraham as a historical figure. And so that's kind of the can of worms that Alejandro's mentioning that we're opening here. And I have like 20 million opinions on this type of issues. I'm not going to express them right now, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that for the audience.
Right. Exactly. So if you're going to, let's say your train of logic or your whatever, right, is dependent on, does the translation match? Like, that's still not going to satisfy um, most critics, because there's like you said, this opens up a huge can of worms that there's really no bottom to it. And so we have to focus on what's relevant and like what's important. And in my opinion, and this is something that John Vervaeke from University of Toronto points out, with ideas this old that influence the people deeply, you have to ask yourself from a psychological point of view, like, what is it about this text that is ringing true or resonating with this group of people, and what's the value that they're extracting from it? And so that might be a way to frame it in a relevant way, because it sort of limits like the can of worms to like a smaller domain.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
the way
I
I've
think
kind of oh yeah, sure.
I was just saying, I think from a very orthodox member's perspective, when it is framed in that perspective, they think that immediately you're just saying, oh, it's a good like fable or a good moral story, kind of like the tortoise and the hare, and you can learn a good lesson from it, but it's not real. I think that's kind of my initial reaction if I'm trying to think from their perspective. Like, how would we don't have to jump into that, but how would one respond to that?
So yeah, I don't want to jump into this. We're going to talk about this at the end of the podcast, the last half. And I've kind of presented this as a very critical, if you just listen to the first half and you stopped right there, you would probably just think that we're all being antagonistic to Mormonism. And I would not describe myself like that at all, or any of you three. And so I think we're going to dedicate the entire portion. Unfortunately, I think Alejandro has to leave before that, but maybe we can get him on another time to kind of comment on that. So I want to save that for the next part. I will say, though, that I think David Bachvoy sums it up beautifully when he says that the Book of Abraham is what Abraham would have written if he had the chance, according to Joseph Smith. And I find in all this messiness something way more interesting and something to explore, because you can figure out how does Revelation work maybe for you, and how does it, because it's not any different between you and, let's say, maybe Joseph Smith per se. And I think there's a lot of beauty to be explored in this, but I want to save that for the next part. But
can I add to that, Brendan?
Sure.
Yeah.
In a nice talk that was given by Elder Oaks, he said the scriptures are a living revelatory vessel for all of us. They should be used like a Urim and Thummim for each and every single one of us. And I think there is some beauty to what you're saying, right? That you get in the character's perspective and you see what they were going through, and it's a way of receiving revelation that way. I mean, there's definitely value in that. I'm not saying that's exactly what's going on here, but there's definitely value in that.
Right. Yeah, I've always been an intellectual person, and seeing complexity in issues is something I think has been bashed out of us, not only in like the modern day, but even within, I think, the church. There's kind of this view that we can only see things as either it's a fraud or it's the true, it's a 100% true. And I just don't see it that way. And I'm going to present this later on. We're going to talk about midrash. We're going to talk about other kind of pseudepigrapha. And we're going to talk about how I don't think it's as black and white as that. But let's get back to the translation problems. How about with the Book of Abraham? And if Alejandro, if you got to sign off, thanks for contributing to this first part. But we'll have you on another time, okay?
Yeah, no problem. I'll see you guys later.
Yeah, catch you later.
Bye.
And I pulled my body from the floor. Hey, I got another chance. I was living like a zombie.